Still, the Father's Day sunlight hit the dining table as my daughter slid a thick envelope to her father-in-law and a pair of socks toward me. As I folded the socks slowly in my hands, keeping my face calm while the check amount was read out loud. While the room filled with polite laughter, the soft rustle of paper seemed louder than anyone's voice. The same sound followed my thoughts as I realized generosity had become a performance and I wasn't the audience anymore. As my chest tightened, I understood this wasn't about money, but about who she believed mattered now. That's when, quietly and without protest, I decided I'd stop being generous with trust. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Father's Day arrived wrapped in perfect weather, the kind that made the manicured lawns of their Connecticut neighborhood look like something out of a brochure. David Carter stood near the dining room window, watching the late afternoon light spill across the table Margaret had set with quiet care. He told himself not to expect much. Emily had been distant lately, busy, distracted. Still, some small, unspoken part of him hoped the day might soften whatever had been hardening between them. Emily arrived with Kyle just after noon, her energy brisk, her smile practiced. Rick Fenton followed close behind, loud and expansive, carrying himself the way men do when they're used to being deferred to. Lunch passed politely enough, conversations skimming the surface traffic, the weather, a new restaurant Rick liked downtown. Then Emily stood, clapped her hands once, and announced it was time for gifts. She handed Rick an envelope first. Rick opened it slowly, theatrically, as if already aware of its weight. When he saw the check, his eyebrows lifted, and a low whistle escaped his lips. "$10,000, he said, loud enough for the whole table. He laughed, pleased, and reached across to squeeze Emily's hand. "That's incredibly generous." David felt his chest tighten. Emily turned to her father next, her smile unchanged, and handed him a small gift bag. Inside was a neatly folded pair of socks. Gray, sensible, the kind you grabbed at the register without thinking. David held them for a moment longer than necessary, his mind lagging behind what his eyes already understood. He forced a smile, nodded once. "Thank you," he said, hoping his voice didn't betray him. Something inside him sank not sharply, but steadily, like an elevator cutting its cable. He told himself it was childish to compare. Still, the contrast sat there on the table between them, undeniable. Rick leaned back in his chair, amused, already launching into a story about how Emily understood the value of investing in family. David listened, the words blurring together, aware only of how small he suddenly felt in his own home. Rick folded the check and slid it into his jacket pocket, patting it as if to make sure it was real. "You didn't have to do this," he said, smiling broadly, "but I appreciate it." David glanced at Emily, searching her face for some explanation, some silent reassurance meant only for him. When their eyes met, she looked away. He cleared his throat. "That's quite a gift," he said carefully. Emily shrugged, dismissive. "It's business, Dad." The word landed wrong. Business. As if fatherhood were a transaction. As if love were something you measured in returns. David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Rick was already talking, Margaret was nodding along, and Emily had picked up her phone, her attention drifting elsewhere. Margaret caught David's eye across the table. Her expression flickered with concern, but only briefly. Later, she seemed to say, "Not now." She leaned over and murmured something about dessert, about not reading too much into it. David nodded, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to. As the afternoon wore on and dinner was served, the conversation grew louder around him, but David felt himself retreat inward. He watched Emily laugh at something Rick said, the ease between them unmistakable. Once, not so long ago, she'd looked at him that way, like he was the safest place in the room. He wondered when that had changed. Had he missed something? A conversation not had? A moment mishandled? He replayed the past year in his mind, searching for a turning point, a reason his daughter would choose to honor another man so publicly, so generously, while reducing him to an afterthought. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet. "You didn't need to make it such a show," he said. Not accusatory, just tired. Emily sighed. "Dad, you're overthinking it. Rick helped us out. This was the right thing to do. Margaret reached for David's arm under the table. A subtle plea to let it go. He felt the warmth of her hand, but it didn't ground him the way it usually did. The distance was already there, widening. As the plates were cleared and coffee poured, David sat back, socks still folded beside his place setting. He looked around the table, his wife, his daughter, his son-in-law, the man who now seemed to occupy a space David didn't realize he'd been losing. And as Father's Day slipped quietly into evening, David couldn't shake the feeling that the gift wasn't the insult. It was the signal. Morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that felt intentional. David woke before the alarm, the house still and unfamiliar, as if it no longer recognized him. Father's Day dishes sat clean and drying in the rack, evidence of a celebration that had left no warmth behind. He stood at the kitchen counter with his phone in hand longer than he meant to, rereading the short text he'd typed to Emily. "Hope you got home safe. Would like to talk when you have time." He sent it, then immediately regretted how careful it sounded. Too polite, too distant. An hour passed, then two. No response. By mid-morning, he tried calling. Straight to voicemail. He left no message. Tried again later. Same result. David told himself she was busy, that Mondays were always hectic, but the silence felt deliberate. It wasn't absence. It was avoidance. Margaret found him sitting at the dining table, phone face down, untouched coffee growing cold. She moved easily around the kitchen, tidying things that were already in order. "She probably just needs space," she said, as if finishing a thought he hadn't spoken aloud. "Yesterday got awkward." David looked up at her. "Awkward doesn't usually mean disappearing." Margaret sighed, the sound practiced. "You're reading too much into it. Emily's always been sensitive. Let it go, David. One gift doesn't erase 32 years. But it hadn't felt like one gift. It had felt like a line drawn. David nodded anyway, because pushing would only turn it into an argument, and he didn't have the energy for that yet. Still, something inside him tightened further, settling into a dull, persistent ache. By lunchtime, his phone buzzed not from Emily, but from a notification, social media. Rick Fenton had posted a photo from the night before. The caption was glowing, almost theatrical, proud moment. Family means investing in those who matter. Beneath it, comments poured in praising Emily's generosity, her maturity, her understanding of real priorities. David stared at the screen longer than he should have. Emily still hadn't replied. He tried once more to call her, then sent another text, shorter this time. "Did I do something wrong?" The message sat there, unread. It felt humiliating, the act of asking his own daughter for reassurance, like a favor. By late afternoon, frustration crept in, sharp and restless. David found himself pacing his office, replaying conversations from the past year. The canceled dinners, the shorter phone calls. The way Emily spoke now, confident, distant, as if she were always in a hurry to get somewhere he wasn't invited. The thought came uninvited, ugly, and persistent. What if I've already been replaced? Rick had money, influence, answers. David had principles and a history that suddenly felt less valuable in comparison. He hated himself for the jealousy, but he couldn't deny it either. Needing something solid, something he could control, David logged into his bank account. Just a quick check. A habit born of decades in business. The familiar numbers loaded, and at first glance, everything looked normal. Then he noticed the withdrawals. They weren't huge individually, but there were several of them. Recent, staggered, transfers tied to an account Emily had access to. His chest tightened as he clicked through the details, his fingers moving slower now. These weren't expenses he recognized. Not groceries, not utilities. They looked intentional, planned. David leaned back in his chair, the room suddenly too quiet. His mind raced ahead, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Emily had moved money temporarily, forgotten to mention it. Still, the timing gnawed at him. Father's Day, the check, the silence. He found Margaret in the living room and showed her the screen. "This," he said, keeping his voice steady, "doesn't feel accidental." Margaret glanced at it, barely a second, then shook her head. "David, no. Emily would never steal from us." "I didn't say steal. You're implying it." "I'm saying something's wrong." Margaret crossed her arms, defensive now. "She's our daughter. She wouldn't betray you like that." You're letting your pride turn this into something it's not." The word pride stung. David closed the laptop slowly. "I just want the truth." "And you'll get it," Margaret said firmly. "But digging like this, you're going to damage things that don't need damaging." David didn't respond. He watched her walk away, the conversation neatly closed from her side. But for him, it was just opening. Later that night, alone in his office again, David reopened the account details. He studied the dates, the amounts, the linked accounts. The pattern was there if you looked long enough. Careful, hidden in plain sight. Emily still hadn't called. As the house settled into sleep, David made a quiet decision. If answers weren't coming to him, he would go looking for them himself. Monday morning arrived without ceremony, gray and unremarkable, which somehow made the call feel heavier when it came. David was in his home office, jacket still on the back of his chair, when his phone lit up with a number he recognized immediately. He answered on the second ring. "David, it's Lisa Hart," the voice said, calm but measured. Too measured. His stomach tightened before she even continued. "What's going on?" "I wanted to make you aware of something before you heard it elsewhere," she said. "Several transactions on Emily's credit cards were declined early this morning." David said nothing at first. He stared at the framed photo on his desk, Emily at 16, smiling without restraint, her arms slung around his shoulders like the world was still simple. "Declined?" he finally asked. "As in, a system error?" There was a pause. "No," Lisa said gently. "As in, maxed out." She explained it clinically, the way bankers are trained to deliver bad news without sounding alarmist. Multiple cards, limits reached, attempts to push through large purchases anyway, high-end retail, travel bookings, restaurant charges that raised red flags because of their frequency and timing. Not one bad weekend, a pattern. David closed his eyes. "These weren't small overages," Lisa continued. "They suggest sustained spending well beyond her reported income." Something cold settled in his chest. He'd expected misjudgment, carelessness maybe. This was something else. This was structure, planning, the kind of financial mess that didn't happen overnight. Is she in trouble?" David asked. "That depends on what happens next," Lisa replied. "Which is why I'm calling you." When the call ended, the room felt too still. David leaned forward, elbows on his desk, hands clasped together as if that might keep everything from slipping further out of reach. His stomach churned, not with anger yet, but with something closer to grief. This wasn't a missed payment. This wasn't youthful recklessness. This was collapse. He reached for his phone and called Emily immediately. Voicemail. He tried again. And again. A text followed. Then another. His messages grew shorter. Less careful. "Call me, please." No response. It felt like shouting into a locked room, knowing someone was inside and choosing not to answer. He stood and paced, his thoughts circling the same questions. How long had this been going on? Who else knew? And why, after all this, had she chosen to hand Rick a $10,000 check? The image returned uninvited Rick's satisfied smile, the weight of the envelope, the casual way he'd tucked it away. At the time, it had felt symbolic. Now, it felt strategic. David pulled the bank statement back up on his screen, his eyes scanning numbers with new suspicion. He imagined Emily sitting at her kitchen table, writing that check, knowing her cards were nearly tapped out, knowing she was standing on the edge of something dangerous and choosing appearance over honesty. He tried calling her once more, straight to voicemail. Anger began to seep in, slow and controlled. Not explosive, worse, focused, the kind that sharpened rather than burned. He didn't raise his voice when he left a message this time. "Emily," he said quietly, "I know something's wrong. I need you to call me. Today." He ended the call and stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring. It didn't. An hour later, Lisa called again. "I can look deeper," she said, "into the account activity, transfers, linked accounts. But once we do that, this stops being theoretical." David hesitated. He imagined what he might find. Debts layered on debts. Decisions Emily had made deliberately, believing she could outrun the consequences, or worse, that someone else was involved. "Do it," he said finally, though the word tasted bitter. "I need to know." "All right," Lisa replied. I'll be discreet, but David, prepare yourself. When the line went dead, David sat back in his chair, suddenly aware of how little control he had left. He had built companies from nothing, negotiated deals that made grown men blink, planned years ahead with precision. And yet here he was, locked out of his daughter's life, watching the edges of it fray without being able to stop it. He glanced once more at the Father's Day photo on his desk, then at the bank screen glowing quietly beside it. Whatever Emily was hiding, it was bigger than hurt feelings now. And it was already costing her more than she knew. The waiting was worse than the knowing. David spent most of that day trapped between emails he couldn't focus on and a phone that refused to ring. Every time it buzzed, his chest tightened, only to loosen again when it wasn't Emily. By late afternoon, Lisa Hart called back, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier neutrality. I went deeper, she said. And David, there are accounts you don't know about. He closed the door to his office and sat down slowly. How many? 3, Lisa replied. Opened over the past 8 months. Different banks, different purposes, all in Emily's name. The words settled heavily in the room. 8 months. That meant this wasn't panic. This was planning. David felt something inside him crack, not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that couldn't be repaired easily. He asked Lisa to walk him through it, and she did, carefully, outlining balances that never quite went positive, credit lines stretched thin, interest stacking quietly in the background. By the time she finished, David was staring at the wall, his reflection faint in the glass. He felt foolish now, remembering the casual way Emily had waved off his questions in the past, how he'd accepted distance as independence. This wasn't independence. This was concealment. When the call ended, David stayed seated, hands resting uselessly on his knees. He thought back over holidays, birthdays, small conversations where Emily had seemed distracted, always checking her phone, always rushing off. He'd assumed it was work, life, adulthood. The truth felt heavier that she'd been carrying this alone, deliberately keeping him out. Or worse, keeping him as a fallback. He pulled up his own records again, tracing the movement of money with a sharper eye now. The pattern was clearer than before. Transfers timed carefully. Debts shifted just enough to avoid immediate alarms. She hadn't been reckless. She'd been strategic. David's hurt turned inward, sharp and personal. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust. About the quiet understanding he'd believed existed between them that if things ever went wrong, she would come to him. Why hadn't she? He found Margaret in the kitchen that evening, chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. He told her what Lisa had found, keeping his voice level, factual, watching for her reaction. That can't be right, she said immediately. Emily wouldn't do that. 3 accounts, David replied. Months of debt. Margaret shook her head, refusing to meet his eyes. People make mistakes. She probably panicked. It doesn't mean she's hiding something from you. David watched her, recognizing the fear beneath the denial. Accepting the truth would mean admitting they hadn't known their own daughter as well as they thought. It would mean accepting that something had gone wrong on their watch. This isn't just a few bad decisions, he said quietly. This is a system. Margaret's knife paused mid-cut. You're making it sound criminal. I'm saying it's deliberate. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Margaret resumed chopping, her movements slower now. Talk to her, she said finally. Don't turn this into an investigation. David didn't respond, because it already was one. That night, he reviewed the documents Lisa had sent over, eyes burning from the screen's glow. And then he saw an account number he recognized, not from Emily's finances, but from a different set of statements entirely. Rick's business account. The transfers were subtle, buried among legitimate expenses, but once he saw them, he couldn't unsee them. Payments routed through Rick's company, debts temporarily parked where they wouldn't draw attention. The check from Father's Day suddenly took on a different weight. It wasn't generosity, it was repayment. Or maybe leverage. David leaned back, the room spinning slightly. Emily hadn't just been hiding from him. She'd been hiding behind Rick, using his resources to prop up a lifestyle she couldn't sustain, and trusting that no one would look too closely. His phone buzzed, then Lisa again. I wanted to flag something else, she said. There's activity tied to a business account. I'm watching it now. I know, David said. His voice was steady, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. Keep watching. Everything. When the call ended, David sat alone in the dark, the weight of what was coming pressing in on him. Confronting Emily would mean tearing the last layer of illusion away, not just for her, but for all of them. And once he did, there would be no going back. Emily arrived that evening with the guarded posture of someone who already knew the conversation would hurt. David didn't waste time on pleasantries. He asked her to sit at the dining table, the same one where Father's Day had unfolded, and placed a thin folder between them. Bank statements, account summaries, dates circled in pen. Her eyes flicked down, then back up. "What's this?" "You tell me," David said. His voice was calm, but it felt carved out of stone. "3 accounts you never mentioned, maxed out credit cards, and withdrawals tied to Rick's business account." Emily's jaw tightened. She crossed her arms, leaning back as if distance might protect her. "You went through my finances?" "I went through what you connected to me," he replied, "and to him." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she exhaled sharply. "I was trying to help," she said. "Rick offered access. It was temporary. I was managing things." "Managing what?" David asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you were hiding debt." Her eyes flashed. "You don't understand how things work anymore, Dad. This wasn't stealing. It was strategic. Rick has liquidity. I moved things around until I could stabilize." David leaned forward. "Stop." The word landed hard enough to break her rhythm. "Don't dress this up. Don't pretend this was some financial chess game. Tell me the truth." Emily's confidence faltered. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." "That's not an answer." Silence stretched between them, heavy and exposed. Finally, she spoke, her voice lower. "I couldn't keep up." "With what?" "With everything," she snapped, then softened immediately. "The house, the expectations. Kyle's business is inconsistent, and everyone assumes we're fine because Rick is... Rick." She swallowed. "I didn't want to look like I was failing." David felt something sink deep in his chest. "So you borrowed?" "Yes," she admitted. "From Rick, from the cards. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd fix it before anyone noticed." "And the accounts?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I needed separation. Places the debt wouldn't collide." David closed his eyes briefly. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. "You were living beyond your means," he said quietly. "And instead of coming to me, you built a maze." Her eyes filled. "I didn't want to disappoint you." The irony almost broke him. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened yard. "Do you have any idea what this feels like?" he asked. "Watching your child lie so convincingly that you start questioning your own judgment?" "I never meant to hurt you," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I just needed time." David turned back to her. "You used another man's business to prop up your life. You put all of us at risk." Tears spilled now. "I was drowning. Every time I tried to fix it, the numbers got worse. I didn't know how to stop without losing everything." Her desperation was real. David could see that, but so was the damage. "I trusted you," he said. "That's what hurts the most." Emily stood and reached for him, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll fix it. I'll pay it back. Just, please don't tell Rick yet." David stiffened. "That's not your choice." Her head snapped up. "You can't. He'll cut me off. He'll destroy Kyle. We won't survive it." "You already might not," David replied. She shook her head violently. "Please, give me time. I'll make it right." David felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the father who wanted to shield his child. And the man who knew lies only grew more expensive the longer they were protected. "You're going to tell him," he said firmly. "Everything." Emily's face went Polly. "I can't." "You will." She stepped back, fear overtaking guilt. "If I lose Rick's support, I lose everything." David looked at her, really looked at her, and realized how far she'd gone to avoid that fear, and how close they were now to something that couldn't be undone. Emily didn't call Rick. David knew that before Lisa confirmed it. The account activity stayed quiet on the surface, but the underlying balances didn't move. No repayments, no corrections, just the same careful shuffling, as if Emily believed that if she kept everything suspended long enough, gravity would forget her. He watched it happen from a distance, each day eroding what little patience he had left. She still texted him, apologies, wrapped in reassurance, promises, without plans. But Rick remained in the dark, and that silence told David everything he needed to know. Emily wasn't fixing anything. She was stalling. What finally settled it wasn't anger. It was clarity. Emily wasn't just lying to him anymore. She was actively betraying Rick using his money, his company, his trust, while letting him play the generous patriarch in public. David understood business, he understood leverage, and he understood that the longer this went on, the more explosive the fallout would be. So he made the call himself. Rick answered on the third ring, his voice upbeat, familiar.
David, was just thinking about you. Everything good?
No, David said. He didn't soften it. We need to talk. The silence on the other end sharpened. David told him everything. The secret accounts, the maxed out cards, the transfers hidden inside Rick's business expenses. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, because the truth didn't need help. Rick didn't interrupt. When David finished, there was a long pause, followed by a slow, disbelieving laugh. That's not possible, Rick said. Emily wouldn't do that. And if she did, you'd have known. I do know, David replied. That's why I'm calling. Anger crept into Rick's voice, layered with something colder. So you're telling me your daughter's been siphoning money from my company, and you're only just now bringing this to me? I'm telling you as soon as I had proof. Another pause. When Rick spoke again, the warmth was gone. Put her on. Emily, who had been hovering just outside the office door, heard her name and stepped in, eyes wide with panic. David held up a hand, firm. Rick knows, he said. No, she whispered. She lunged for the phone, but David turned away, his heart pounding. Emily? Rick's voice cut through the speaker, sharp now. Is this true? She froze, tears spilling freely. I was going to tell you. When? Rick snapped. After I found out from my accountant? She shook her head, unable to form words. David watched his daughter crumble, the weight of the lie finally too heavy to carry. Rick's fury was controlled, which scared David more than shouting would have. You used my company to hide your debt, he said. You let me stand there on Father's Day and smile like an idiot. I needed help, Emily cried. I thought I could fix it. You thought wrong. David felt the damage ripple outward, each word another fracture in the family's foundation. He wanted to step in, to shield Emily from the full force of Rick's anger, but this was no longer his place to intervene. I trusted you, Rick continued, and you made me complicit in your mess. I'll pay it back, Emily said desperately. I swear, Rick exhaled slowly. You will, every dollar, and until you do, we're done. The line went dead. Emily collapsed into the chair, sobbing openly now. The last of her defenses gone. David stood there, numb, the phone still warm in his hand. He felt no relief, only loss. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But watching his daughter sit alone in the wreckage of her own making, David understood that some truths, once spoken, didn't just expose lies. They changed everything forever. The fallout was immediate and merciless. Within 48 hours of Rick cutting her off, Emily's carefully balanced world collapsed in on itself. Accounts she had leaned on went dark. Credit lines she'd stretched thin were frozen outright. David moved quietly but decisively, reclaiming control over the family trust she'd once had easy access to, not as punishment, but as containment. The damage had already been done. Now it was about stopping the bleeding. Emily spiraled. Kyle was the first to knock on David's door, his expression strained, confusion etched deep into his face. He spoke fast, like someone trying to outrun bad news. Rick's not returning my calls, he said. Emily says there's been a misunderstanding. I thought maybe you could help smooth things over. David listened without interrupting, noting how little Kyle actually knew. The man genuinely believed this was a dispute between egos, not the exposure of a long-running deception. You need to talk to your wife, David said evenly. There's more going on than you realize. Kyle frowned. About what? But David didn't answer. Some truths had to come from Emily herself. Claire arrived that weekend, quieter than usual, her presence careful. She hugged David tightly, longer than necessary, then sat with him on the back porch as the evening cooled. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer opinions. But when Emily's name came up, Claire looked away, her loyalty torn. "I just want everyone to stop hurting," she said softly. David nodded. He understood that impulse better than anyone. Still, when Claire's hand rested briefly on his arm, he felt the unspoken message there. She might not choose sides, but she saw the cost of what Emily had done. And she wasn't blind to who had been holding the family together while everything came apart. Margaret said very little during those days. She moved through the house like a ghost, tending to small routines as if they could anchor her. When Emily called, Margaret listened. When David spoke, she listened too. She offered no judgments, no solutions, only silence, stretched thin with worry. David knew she was grieving the family she thought they were. Then the call started, first from the credit card companies, then from lenders, then from the bank itself. Each conversation stripped another layer away, exposing how deep Emily's situation really was. Payment demands, frozen assets, deadlines that couldn't be negotiated away with charm or borrowed time. Emily showed up one night unannounced, eyes red, shoulders slumped. She looked smaller somehow, the confidence that once armored her completely gone. She stood in the doorway like a child again, unsure whether she was welcome. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice barely steady. "I know I ruined everything. I need help." David felt the weight of it settle into his bones. He wanted to reach for her, to tell her they'd figure it out the way they always had. But he was so tired of lies, tired of being the last to know. "You don't get to skip the truth anymore," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "I'm done hiding." He believed she meant it. That didn't make it easier. David walked to the window, staring out into the dark yard, gathering himself. When he turned back, his voice was firm, stripped of anger, but heavy with resolve. "I will help you rebuild," he said, "but only if you take full responsibility. No excuses, no shortcuts. You face every consequence, and you do it honestly." Emily nodded, tears spilling freely. "I will." David held her gaze, knowing this was only the beginning. Forgiveness would not come quickly, trust even less so. But for the first time since Father's Day, there was a fragile line forward, one that demanded accountability before healing. And whether Emily was truly ready to walk, it remained to be seen. Redemption didn't arrive with apologies or dramatic gestures. It began quietly, almost reluctantly, in a small office Emily would have never stepped into before all of this. She sat across from a financial counselor with her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor as numbers were laid out in front of her without judgment. There was no scolding, no sympathy, just facts. For the first time, Emily couldn't look away. She didn't argue. She didn't minimize. When the counselor asked if she was ready to commit to a plan that would take years, not months, Emily hesitated only a second before nodding. Pride had already cost her everything. She wasn't willing to let it cost her more. David hadn't pushed her into it. He'd simply made it a condition. Support would be available. Guidance too, but only if she owned every decision that followed. No hiding, no deflection, no one else to blame. "You do the work," he told her. "I won't do it for you." She agreed, quietly. The days that followed were stripped of illusion. Emily canceled subscriptions, sold things she'd once used to define herself, and began structuring payments she knew would barely make a dent at first. Rick's repayment sat at the top of the list, non-negotiable. Each transfer felt like a confession, a reminder of how far she'd fallen. David monitored from a distance. He didn't hover. He didn't lecture. He reviewed reports when she sent them and asked questions when something didn't make sense. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Trust, he knew, didn't return because someone tried harder. It returned when patterns changed. Still, there were moments he caught himself watching her more closely than he meant to. Listening for excuses, waiting for the familiar evasions. They never came. That should have reassured him. Instead, it left him cautious. He'd been fooled once. One evening, Margaret found him sitting alone in the living room, papers spread across the coffee table. She lowered herself onto the couch beside him, her voice gentle. "She's trying," she said. "I know," David replied. "Trying isn't the same as fixing." Margaret nodded. "But it's how fixing starts." They sat in silence for a while. Then Margaret reached for his hand. "Don't make her earn forgiveness before she's had a chance to earn stability. She needs to know there's something waiting on the other side of this." David stared ahead, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. "I'm afraid if I let go too soon, she'll think it didn't matter. And I'm afraid if you hold on too tightly, she'll think it's hopeless, Margaret said softly. That night, David didn't argue. He didn't concede either. But he listened. Emily's progress came in small, unremarkable steps. Budget spreadsheets, missed invitations she could no longer afford, long conversations with Kyle that were no longer about appearances, but survival. The life she'd built on borrowed confidence was gone. What remained was harder but real. The emotional damage lingered. Emily carried it in the way she hesitated before speaking, the way she waited for David's reaction before allowing herself relief. David felt it too in the restraint he maintained, the distance he hadn't yet closed. Forgiveness wasn't something he could force. It had to grow, slowly, alongside accountability. One afternoon, as Emily left, after dropping off updated statements, David stood in the doorway and watched her walk to her car. She looked tired, older, but steadier than she had in a long time. He realized then that being there for her didn't mean forgetting what she'd done. It meant staying present while she proved she wouldn't do it again. And that, David knew, would take time. Rebuilding proved harder than the collapse itself. Once the urgency faded, Emily was left with the slow grind of consequences, numbers that didn't move fast enough, limits that couldn't be pushed, and a lifestyle that now demanded discipline instead of denial. She tracked every dollar, every payment, every compromise. There were weeks when doing everything right still felt like failure. When progress was measured in inches instead of miles, she moved into a smaller routine, one that required constant restraint. Dinners out became rare. Vacations disappeared entirely. The weight of debt followed her everywhere, not just on paper but in the quiet moments when she lay awake, calculating what she could afford to lose next. For the first time in her adult life, she lived inside boundaries she couldn't talk her way around. David observed from a careful distance. He asked for updates, reviewed plans, but resisted the instinct to step in and fix things. Part of him wanted to. Years of fatherhood and leadership had wired him that way, but he also knew that too much involvement would undo the very lesson Emily needed to learn. Support, he reminded himself, didn't mean control. Still, watching was its own kind of pain. At home, the strain seeped into Emily's marriage. Kyle tried to be patient, but patience had limits when finances dictated every decision. Conversations that once revolved around plans now revolved around restrictions. He questioned purchases. She defended choices. Neither of them fully trusted the other's judgment anymore, and that absence hollowed out even simple interactions. David saw it during family gatherings, the way Kyle fell quiet when money came up, the way Emily flinched at questions that weren't meant to accuse. The tension was constant, low grade, eroding what little stability they had left. It was the kind of stress that didn't explode but wore things down slowly, relentlessly. Late one evening, David found himself asking a question he hadn't wanted to face. Does she really understand what she did? He knew Emily regretted the outcome. He wasn't as sure she grasped the full weight of the betrayal, the trust she'd broken, the risks she'd imposed on others without consent. Regret was emotional. Understanding was structural. And he wasn't convinced they were the same. That doubt followed him into their next conversation, when Emily sat across from him at the kitchen table, looking more uncertain than he'd seen her in years. "I need your advice," she said. "About work." David stiffened slightly. "What about it?" "My reputation took a hit," she admitted. "I want to rebuild, but I don't know where to start. You've done this before. I thought maybe—" She trailed off, careful not to ask outright. David considered her words, choosing his response with equal care. "I can give you perspective," he said slowly. "Not solutions." She nodded. "That's all I'm asking." He offered guidance without direction, questions instead of answers, principles instead of tactics. As they talked, David felt the familiar pull to do more, to step back into the role he'd always occupied. He resisted it. Emily needed to earn her footing this time. Meanwhile, her attempts to make amends with Rick stalled completely. She sent updates, payment confirmations, messages acknowledging fault. Rick responded only through accountants and lawyers. No warmth, no forgiveness. Just distance and demand. Every interaction reminded her that some bridges, once burned, didn't rebuild. They only stabilized enough to cross safely. The family felt the strain in quieter ways too. Conversations were guarded. Trust was conditional. No one pretended otherwise. Even when things went right, The past hovered close enough to remind them it could happen again. Emily understood now that apologies didn't reset timelines. Trust moved at its own pace, indifferent to effort or intent. Some days, that reality felt heavier than the debt itself. And as she worked through it, day by disciplined day, David watched, still unsure how this would end, only knowing that the path forward would test all of them longer than anyone wanted to admit. The revelation didn't come all at once. It surfaced the way uncomfortable truths often do through inconsistencies that refused to stay buried. David noticed it while reviewing one of the updated reports Emily had submitted. A detail that didn't belong. A payment routed through a small LLC, one he didn't recognize, listed as a business expense rather than personal debt. Kyle's company. At first, David assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error. But the deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. Emily's spending wasn't just hidden. It had been absorbed, folded neatly into Kyle's operating costs, disguised as vendor payments, marketing fees, short-term advances. It wasn't reckless impulse anymore. It was structure. David's hands trembled slightly as he spread the documents across his desk. This wasn't about one bad decision compounding into another. This was a system that had allowed Emily to live beyond her means without triggering immediate consequences. And Kyle's business, whether knowingly or not, had been the conduit. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He called Kyle that afternoon and asked him to come by. No explanation, no warning. Kyle arrived uneasy, sensing the shift in tone the moment David closed the door behind him. "What's going on?" Kyle asked. David handed him the paperwork. "You tell me." Kyle scanned the pages, confusion giving way to something closer to dread. "These are business expenses," he said slowly. "Marketing, travel, consulting?" "No," David cut in. "They're personal liabilities, routed through your accounts." Kyle looked up, shaken. "That can't be right." "It is," David said. "And it's been happening for months." Kyle sank into the chair, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I mean, I knew Emily was stressed, but I didn't track every transaction. I trusted her. She handles the books." David felt anger rise, sharp and unfiltered. "You didn't think it was your responsibility to know where your company's money was going?" Kyle flinched. "I should have paid more attention. I know that now. But I swear I had no idea how deep this went." David studied him, searching for deception. What he saw instead was negligence, a different kind of failure, but a failure all the same. When Kyle left, David sat alone for a long time, the weight of the truth settling in. Emily hadn't acted alone, and Kyle hadn't been innocent, just absent. The betrayal expanded outward, touching more than just one relationship. It poisoned the foundation beneath all of them. That night, Emily arrived to find David waiting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I know about Kyle's accounts," he said, her face drained of color. "Dad." "Don't," he replied. "Just listen." She sat, her composure cracking. "He didn't know," she said quickly. "I handled everything. I thought if I kept it contained—" "You didn't keep it contained," David said. "You spread it." Emily covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. "I was trying to protect him. Protect us." "By lying to everyone?" The silence that followed was heavy, unbearable. Emily looked caught between two collapsing worlds, her father's trust and her marriage's stability. Kyle's recklessness, her desperation, all of it tangled together now. Impossible to separate cleanly. Kyle called later that night, voice thick with regret. "I'll fix it," he said. "I'll audit everything, restructure, take responsibility." David listened, unmoved. "Intent doesn't erase impact," he said. "And right now, I don't know who I can trust." Emily tried to rebuild both relationships at once, but the strain showed. With David, she was careful, almost restrained. With Kyle, conversations stretched late into the night, filled with guilt and uncertainty. She stood between two men who now saw her not just as someone who'd made mistakes, but as the center of a system that had failed all of them. David watched it unfold with a heavy heart. The damage was deeper than he'd thought. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about accountability, boundaries, and the cost of avoidance. He realized then that restoring trust wouldn't come from patching holes. It would require confronting the entire structure that allowed this to happen. And that meant one more conversation, one that neither Emily nor Kyle was ready for, but one David knew he could no longer avoid. The fracture didn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It crept in quietly, settling into every interaction until the house felt unfamiliar, divided by tensions no one knew how to cross. The more the truth surfaced, the heavier it became. Each new detail about the finances didn't clarify things, it complicated them, deepening the distance between David, Emily, and Kyle. Conversations turned cautious. Words were chosen carefully, then often withheld altogether. Emily sat through family dinners, barely touching her food, eyes downcast, as if presence alone required more strength than she had left. Kyle tried to stay engaged, but his attempts at normalcy only highlighted how far things had slipped. Nothing was simple anymore. Everything carried weight. Margaret worked tirelessly to keep the peace, though peace felt increasingly out of reach. She spoke softly, urging patience, reminding David of Emily's effort, reminding Emily of her father's pain. But each attempt left her more exhausted, caught between the instinct to protect her daughter and the loyalty she felt toward her husband. There were nights she lay awake beside David, staring into the dark, unsure which silence hurt more, the ones at the table or the ones in their bedroom. Emily withdrew further as the pressure mounted. The numbers loomed constantly, but it was the emotional debt that crushed her. She stopped calling as often, afraid of saying the wrong thing, of reopening wounds she couldn't heal. Guilt followed her everywhere, heavy and unrelenting. Every attempt at progress felt insignificant against the damage she'd done. Kyle tried, in his own way, to make things right. One afternoon, he asked David to meet him alone. His apology was earnest, his voice strained. "I should have been paying attention," he said. "I trusted without verifying. I see that now." David listened, but the words landed flat.
"Not knowing doesn't absolve you,"
he replied quietly.
"It just means you weren't looking."
Kyle nodded, chastened, but there was confusion in his eyes, a gap between intent and understanding. He struggled to grasp how his inattention had enabled everything that followed, how absence could be as damaging as action. As days passed, David pulled back, not out of anger, but self-preservation. He limited conversations, avoided prolonged time together, retreated into work and solitude. In a house full of people, he felt increasingly alone. The roles he'd inhabited, father, protector, anchor, felt uncertain now, stripped of the trust that had once made them natural. Late at night, David replayed the past in his mind, searching for signs he'd missed. He wondered if he'd mistaken distance for independence, if his own reserve had taught Emily to hide rather than ask for help. The questions offered no comfort, only the unsettling realization that good intentions didn't guarantee good outcomes. The family existed in fragments now connected by history, separated by hurt. No one knew how to bring them back together without reopening wounds that still bled beneath the surface. Even moments of calm felt temporary, fragile. David came to understand that healing wouldn't be swift or straightforward. It would demand patience none of them had practiced before, honesty that might bruise more than it healed, and time that refused to be rushed. And as the fracture widened, David saw clearly that no single conversation, no single act of forgiveness would repair what had been broken. The road ahead would be long, and for the first time, he wasn't sure who would still be walking it with him. The shift from family crisis to legal battle was abrupt and unforgiving. What had once been private conversations and painful revelations hardened into formal notices and carefully worded emails. David recognized the change immediately, the moment the language turned clinical, the moment accountability stopped being emotional and became contractual. Rick didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he acted. Within days, David's attorney called to confirm what David already suspected. Rick was preparing legal action over the misuse of his business accounts. Fraud was the word no one wanted to say out loud, but it hovered over every conversation like a shadow. David sat across from his attorney in a glass-walled conference room, listening as potential outcomes were laid out with practiced calm: civil liability, restitution, reputational damage. David asked precise questions, his mind shifting into a familiar gear. This was territory he understood: negotiation, risk management, containment. Still, this time was different. This wasn't a competitor or a contract gone wrong. This was family. Emily felt that weight more acutely with each passing day. She moved between consultations and tense conversations at home. Her loyalties pulled in opposite directions. Protecting Kyle meant cooperation. Protecting David meant transparency. Every choice felt like a betrayal of someone she loved. The emotional strain hollowed her out, leaving her exhausted and uncertain. Kyle, to his credit, didn't resist the process. He opened his books, provided records, answered questions without deflection. He wanted resolution fast and clean. David noted the effort, but effort couldn't undo the damage already done. Cooperation now was necessary, but it didn't rewrite the past. As the case progressed, David stepped in more forcefully. He coordinated responses, reviewed filings, and advised on strategy. His business experience proved invaluable, helping navigate timelines and exposure, pushing for settlement discussions before positions hardened beyond repair. But each decision carried weight beyond dollars. Every concession felt like a personal compromise. Emily watched these negotiations with a growing sense of dread. Seeing her father operate in this arena, controlled, composed, decisive, forced her to confront what her actions had set in motion. This wasn't just about debt anymore. It was about legacy, about the reputation David had built over decades, now threatened by choices she'd made in fear and pride. One night, she sat alone at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, surrounded by documents she barely understood. The numbers blurred together. What remained was the realization that her mistakes had rippled outward, touching everything she cared about: her marriage, her family, her future. The pressure intensified as deadlines approached. Depositions loomed. Settlement terms shifted. Rick's position remained rigid, his trust irreparably broken. David felt the strain in subtle ways, a tightness in his chest, sleepless nights, a constant undercurrent of vigilance. He'd spent a lifetime building stability, and now he was fighting to keep it from collapsing under the weight of someone else's decisions. The legal battle consumed them, reshaping relationships into alliances and liabilities. David found himself at the center of it all, balancing responsibility and resentment, strategy and grief. As the case moved forward, one truth became impossible to ignore: there would be no outcome without cost. And whatever the final judgment, nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The turning point didn't come with a courtroom ruling or a dramatic confession. It arrived quietly, in the form of a decision Emily finally made without being pushed. She asked to meet with David alone. No lawyers, no intermediaries, no defenses left to hide behind. She didn't sit down right away. She stood across from him, hands clasped, eyes steady in a way they hadn't been for months. "This is my fault," she said. No explanations followed, no justifications, just the truth, spoken plainly. David felt the words land differently than all the apologies before them. Responsibility carried weight. It demanded something back. "I made every choice that led here," Emily continued. "And I know I can't undo it, but I'm done pretending it wasn't mine to fix." David said nothing at first. He let the silence stretch, measuring not her tone, but her resolve. For the first time since this began, he believed she understood the scale of what she'd done, not just financially, but relationally. Still, belief didn't erase a consequence. He moved forward with the legal process anyway. Protecting the family's assets wasn't a matter of forgiveness, it was duty. He signed documents, approved strategy, prepared for court with the same focus he'd always applied to his work. The betrayal still sat heavy in his chest, but he refused to let emotion compromise responsibility. As the final proceedings approached, the tension within the family sharpened. Emily and Kyle argued more openly now, not out of denial but exhaustion. Every discussion felt urgent, every disagreement magnified by the stakes. David watched it all with a guarded distance, unwilling to intervene where accountability was still being learned. The night before a key hearing, Emily came to him again. This time, her voice trembled. "I'm not asking you to forget," she said. "I just need to know if there's a way forward." David looked at her for a long moment. "There is," he said, "but it won't look like before." "I know," she replied. "I'm ready for that." He nodded slowly. "Then you'll need to keep choosing responsibility, even when it's uncomfortable." "I will." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was support. The family began, cautiously, to find moments of connection again, brief conversations, shared meals that didn't end in silence. The fractures remained visible, but they no longer defined every interaction. Healing, David knew, wasn't about erasing damage. It was about learning how to live with it without letting it dictate the future. As the court date drew closer, both David and Emily felt the weight of what lay ahead. The legal outcome would matter, But it wouldn't decide everything. Redemption wasn't something a judge could grant. It was something Emily would have to earn, step by step, long after the verdict was delivered. And as father and daughter prepared to face that reality together, both understood this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something harder. The courtroom was colder than Emily expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Everything about it was designed to strip emotion away: polished wood, muted colors, the quiet shuffle of papers that sounded louder than it should have. She sat between Kyle and her attorney, hands folded tightly, trying to steady her breathing as the judge entered. This was it. No more explanations. No more revisions to the story she told herself. When the proceedings began, the facts were laid out plainly. Dates, amounts, account numbers. Each detail felt like a small exposure. Another layer peeled back in front of strangers. Emily kept her eyes forward, forcing herself not to look at David until she could do it without flinching. Then Rick took the stand. He spoke without theatrics, his voice controlled. Professional, he outlined the misuse of his business accounts, the trust he had extended, and the damage that followed, not just financially, but reputationally. He talked about audits triggered, partnerships questioned, credibility eroded. This wasn't personal revenge. It was accountability. David listened in silence. He didn't look at Rick with anger or satisfaction. He looked at him with the recognition of one businessman to another, understanding the cost of betrayal when it entered the ledger. When Rick finished, the courtroom felt heavier, as if the truth had weight of its own. Emily's throat tightened. There was no denying it now, no minimizing. Every consequence Rick described traced back to a choice she had made. The judge took time before delivering the ruling, flipping through notes, adjusting his glasses. When he spoke, his tone was firm but measured. He ruled in Rick's favor, ordering full repayment of the misused funds. The amount was substantial enough to ensure years of financial discipline, but not impossible. A structured payment plan was approved, one that balanced restitution with the reality of Emily's situation. Relief and dread collided in her chest. She hadn't escaped accountability, but she hadn't been crushed by it either. Kyle squeezed her hand, his support immediate, instinctive. "We'll get through this," he whispered. Emily nodded, though she knew the words carried less certainty than they once had. Their marriage had shifted under pressure, reshaped by secrets and stress. Support remained, but innocence was gone. David watched his daughter absorb the judgment, saw the way her shoulders sagged under its weight. He felt a familiar pull to step in, to protect, to soften the blow. But this wasn't a moment he could intervene in. This was hers to carry. As the hearing concluded and people began to file out, David remained seated for a moment longer. He looked at Emily, then not as the child he once shielded, but as an adult facing consequences with eyes open. There was pain in that realization, and pride, and grief for the family he thought they were. Outside the courtroom, the air felt sharper, clearer. Emily stood quietly, absorbing the finality of it all. "I know this isn't the end," she said softly, not looking at anyone in particular. David nodded. "No," he replied. "It's the beginning of the work that actually matters." Kyle wrapped an arm around Emily, and for a moment they stood together, uncertain but resolved. David watched them, aware that some changes could never be undone. The trust they were rebuilding would never be naive again. The family they were becoming would be different from the one they'd lost. And as they walked away from the courthouse, David understood something with quiet clarity. The judgment had settled the legal debt. But the harder reckoning, the one that would decide whether they healed or simply endured, was still waiting for them at home. The aftermath unfolded slowly, without drama or spectacle. There were no sudden resolutions, no clean lines separating past from future, just process. Emily set up the first repayment to Rick within days of the ruling, the transfer confirmation sitting in her inbox like a reminder she couldn't delete. It wasn't the size of the payment that weighed on her, it was what it represented. Every dollar sent was an acknowledgement of trust broken, of consequences earned. The emotional toll followed her everywhere. She moved through her days with careful restraint, measuring words, avoiding anything that resembled entitlement. The freedom she'd once taken for granted was gone, replaced by structure and obligation. It was exhausting, necessary, humbling. Kyle felt the strain in quieter ways. He went through the motions, work, home, conversations, but something in him had withdrawn. He spoke less, listened less. retreating into a private reckoning he didn't yet have language for. The revelations about Emily's dishonesty had shaken more than his finances. They'd unsettled his sense of partnership. Trust, once assumed, now required effort he didn't know how to summon. David noticed it during visits, the space Kyle left between himself and Emily on the couch, the way his attention drifted when she spoke. It worried him, but he stayed out of it. This was a fracture he couldn't mend for them. His own relationship with Emily remained fragile, defined by cautious honesty. They spoke more often now, but never lightly. Each conversation felt like a test of restraint, of sincerity. Emily didn't avoid the past. She acknowledged it openly, without defensiveness, and that mattered more to David than apologies ever had. Margaret hovered somewhere in between, offering steady support while quietly mourning the family she'd believed they were. She listened, encouraged, cooked meals no one had much appetite for. At night, she admitted to David how lost she felt, how every role she'd known seemed altered. He held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to fix yet. Emily's professional life suffered consequences of its own. Opportunities stalled. Conversations grew formal. Her reputation, once polished by association and assumption, now had to stand on its own. She took on work that didn't excite her, roles that offered no prestige, just stability. It hurt, but she accepted it as part of the cost. One evening, Emily and David sat together on the back porch, the air cooling as dusk settled in. They didn't talk about money or court or debt. They talked about small things, books, weather, memories that felt safe enough to revisit. The silence between them was comfortable for the first time in months. "I know this won't be quick," Emily said quietly. David nodded. "Nothing worth rebuilding ever is." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something different in her eyes. Not desperation. Resolve. The family didn't pretend they were healed. They didn't celebrate progress. They simply showed up again and again, committed to the work no one could rush. It was the beginning of something slower than forgiveness, but stronger. The new beginning didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt more like learning to walk on ground that had shifted beneath them. Emily took a second job without announcing it, quietly rearranging her days to make room for the extra hours. Mornings began earlier. Nights ended later. She sold what she didn't need, canceled what she once considered normal, and built a routine that left little room for indulgence. Control came back slowly, earned through repetition and restraint. David noticed the changes before Emily mentioned them. The updated spreadsheets were cleaner. Payments arrived on schedule. There were no last-minute explanations, no rushed apologies attached. It didn't erase what had happened, but it mattered. Trust didn't return in a rush. It edged forward cautiously, like something that remembered being hurt. The scars were still there for David. Certain moments caught him off guard, a delayed response, a vague answer, and his instinct was to brace for impact. He hated that about himself, hated how easily doubt resurfaced, but he didn't retreat from it. He stayed present, reminding himself that rebuilding trust wasn't about pretending nothing had happened. It was about watching what happened next. Margaret and David found themselves navigating their own quiet reckoning. They talked more now, real conversations, not logistical ones. They admitted fears they'd avoided naming, frustrations they'd tucked away to keep things stable. Some evenings ended unresolved, but they no longer avoided the tension. Communication, they were learning, wasn't about agreement. It was about honesty without retreat. Emily's professional life began to show small signs of recovery. A former contact returned to call. A project landed not prestigious, but promising. She approached each opportunity carefully, knowing her reputation would have to be rebuilt one interaction at a time. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Progress came slower than she wanted, but it came honestly. At home, the hardest conversation waited. Kyle and Emily sat across from each other long after dinner one night, the house quiet around them. There was no anger left, only fatigue and truth. Kyle spoke first, admitting how lost he'd felt, how shaken his trust had been. Emily listened without interrupting, absorbing the words without defensiveness. "I don't know if we can go back," Kyle said finally. "I don't want to," Emily replied. "I want to move forward, together, if you're willing." They didn't promise easy answers. They promised effort. It was enough to keep going. One Saturday morning, David and Emily sat side by side in a financial counseling session, the dynamic unfamiliar but necessary. They spoke openly about boundaries, transparency, expectations. The counselor guided, but the real work happened in the moments between when Emily answered without evasion, when David listened without assuming the worst. Afterward, they walked to their cars in silence. "I'm glad we're doing this," Emily said. "So am I," David replied. And he meant it. The future still felt uncertain. Nothing about their situation came with guarantees, but there was movement now. Intention. The family wasn't healed, but it was facing forward, together, step by deliberate step. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough to keep going. The tide didn't turn with a single gesture. It shifted in subtle ways, through consistency rather than promises. David found himself answering Emily's calls without hesitation now, not because the past was forgotten, but because her actions had become predictable in the best way. Payments arrived when they were supposed to. Conversations stayed honest. Excuses no longer filled the space where accountability belonged. He noticed the effort she put into her marriage, too. The long evenings spent talking instead of avoiding. The way Kyle no longer looked through her but at her. Even when the conversation was uncomfortable, David didn't involve himself. But he saw enough to understand that whatever remained between them was being rebuilt deliberately. Not out of fear, but intention. One afternoon, Emily stopped by unannounced, not with paperwork or updates, but with coffee. They sat on the porch, the rhythm between them easier than it had been in years. She watched him carefully, then spoke. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you until I lost your trust," she said. "I thought support was just there. I didn't see what it cost you." David didn't dismiss the words. He let them settle. "We don't always see what's holding us up," he replied. "That doesn't mean we can't learn." She nodded, eyes bright. Gratitude replaced defensiveness now, and David felt something inside him ease. The hurt was still there, but it no longer dictated every interaction. Kyle and Emily continued their work quietly. There were no grand declarations, just decisions reinforced daily. Some nights ended unresolved. Others ended with understanding. They accepted that what they were rebuilding wouldn't resemble what they'd lost. It would be something sturdier, shaped by experience rather than assumption. Margaret and David, in turn, found themselves talking more openly than they had in years. They spoke about fears they'd never voiced, expectations they'd assumed were shared but never confirmed. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was real. Trust, they realized, wasn't maintained by silence. It was strengthened by confronting what silence allowed to grow. The family began to find a fragile peace with the past. Mistakes were acknowledged without being relived endlessly. Progress was measured in days that didn't feel heavy, in dinners that ended with conversation instead of tension. No one pretended the damage hadn't happened. They simply stopped letting it define every moment. Emily's professional efforts started to pay off. She earned back trust slowly, through reliability, through follow-through, through humility. Colleagues noticed. Opportunities followed. Nothing came easily, but everything came honestly. David watched it all with cautious optimism. He knew scars didn't disappear. They reminded you where to be careful, but they also proved survival. One evening, as the house settled into quiet, David stood at the window and looked out at the familiar yard. He felt older than he had before this began, but he also felt clearer. The future hadn't been taken from them. It was still there, waiting to be shaped by what they chose to do next. The dinner wasn't announced as anything special. No occasion, no milestone, just a quiet invitation that everyone accepted without hesitation. When they gathered around the table, the familiarity of it all felt almost fragile, as if speaking too loudly might undo the progress they'd made. David watched them take their seats, noticing the small differences. Emily arrived early, helping Margaret in the kitchen without being asked. Kyle poured drinks, lingering in conversation. Instead of retreating into his phone, there was no tension in the air, only a careful attentiveness that came from shared experience. They talked about ordinary things at first. Work, weather, a neighbor's renovation. But beneath the surface, each of them was aware of the road that had brought them here, the arguments, the silences, the reckoning that had nearly fractured them beyond repair. Being together like this felt earned. Midway through the meal, David set his fork down. The table went quiet. He didn't look at Emily right away. He took a breath. "I want to say something," he began. "Not about the past, about what you've done since." Emily stiffened slightly, then met his eyes. "You didn't run," David continued. "You didn't hide. You did the work when it would have been easier to blame or disappear." His voice held steady, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. "That takes courage." Emily's eyes filled, but she didn't look away.
"I learned it from you,"
she said softly. David nodded once. The moment passed without ceremony, but something in the room shifted. As the evening went on, Emily found herself weighing in on plans, suggesting changes, asking questions, offering solutions. Not with entitlement, but with intention. David noticed the difference immediately. She wasn't asserting control, she was earning it back, one thoughtful decision at a time. Margaret reached for David's hand beneath the table, her grip warm and familiar. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the house settled into its quieter rhythms, she leaned close to him. "We made it through," she whispered. David squeezed her hand. "We're still making it through." They shared a look that carried decades of understanding, the acknowledgement that challenges hadn't vanished, only changed shape. Their commitment, tested and reaffirmed, felt steadier for it. Across the room, Emily and Kyle sat close, talking in low voices. There was no pretense of perfection between them, but there was effort, awareness, a shared understanding that trust wasn't something reclaimed overnight, but something rebuilt through consistency and care. The family lingered long after dinner, unwilling to rush the moment. Laughter surfaced, tentative at first, then easier. For the first time in a long while, the sound didn't feel out of place. David leaned back and took it all in. The scars were still there. He knew that. They always would be. But scars were proof of healing, not failure. This family had been tested in ways none of them had expected. And though the past couldn't be rewritten, they had learned how to rebuild together. The idea for the new project didn't come from a boardroom or a moment of ambition. It came quietly during one of David and Emily's regular check-ins, when transparency had stopped feeling like a requirement and started feeling like a shared value. David suggested it carefully, not as a test, but as an invitation. "We rebuild something together," he said. "From the ground up. No shortcuts, no shadows." Emily understood what he was really offering. Trust not assumed, but earned through structure. They began small. A modest family venture focused on managing assets with clear oversight, shared reporting, and accountability built into every decision. Nothing moved without documentation. Nothing happened without explanation. Emily insisted on systems that would have felt restrictive once, but now felt grounding. For the first time, transparency wasn't a sacrifice. It was the point. The rest of the family watched with cautious optimism. Lessons learned the hard way had reshaped how they approached everything. Assumptions were replaced with conversations. Expectations were stated instead of implied. Trust became something active, not passive. Emily found her voice in the process, not loud, not performative, but steady. She asked difficult questions. She challenged decisions respectfully. When she made mistakes, she corrected them without defensiveness. David noticed. Not because he was looking for flaws, but because he was watching growth. Respect returned slowly, but it returned honestly. Margaret and David, meanwhile, found themselves reconnecting in ways they hadn't anticipated. Without the unspoken tension that had once filled their home, they talked more freely about the future, about what they wanted their lives to look like beyond crisis management. Their partnership felt renewed, not because it had been tested, but because it had been examined and chosen again. The business responded to the change in tone. Clients noticed the clarity. Partners appreciated the consistency. Decisions made with integrity held firm under pressure. What had once been threatened by secrecy now grew stronger through openness. David watched it all with quiet pride. The family he'd feared was broken beyond repair was evolving into something sturdier, less polished, perhaps, but more honest. His relationship with Emily, once defined by disappointment, became a source of fulfillment, not because the past was forgotten, but because it had been transformed into guidance rather than regret. One evening, as David locked up the office, Emily lingered by the door. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up on me," she replied. David smiled faintly. "You didn't give up on yourself. That's what matters." The future didn't feel guaranteed. It never would, but it felt possible. The family stood on shared ground now, united by experience rather than illusion, moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose. And as they looked ahead, they knew whatever came next would be faced together, clear-eyed, accountable, and stronger for what they had survived. The dinner unfolded without ceremony, but it carried more meaning than any celebration they'd hosted before. No speeches, no toasts, just the quiet presence of people who had survived something together. David sat at the head of the table, watching the way conversation flowed, now unforced, steady, honest. It struck him how far they'd come from that Father's Day afternoon when silence had first settled in. Emily moved easily between the kitchen and the table, checking in, listening more than she spoke. There was a calm to her that hadn't existed before, a grounded confidence that didn't need validation. When everyone was seated, she paused, took a breath, and looked at her father. "I know trust isn't something you just get back," she said. "But I want you to know, I don't take it for granted anymore. Not with you, not with anyone." The room went still. David met her gaze and felt the weight of the journey between them, the anger, the grief, the nights spent questioning his own judgment.
"You didn't just say you'd change,"
he replied. "You did. That's what matters." Emily nodded, emotion flickering across her face before she steadied herself. This wasn't a moment of redemption handed out freely. It was recognition earned through effort. The family business, once strained to the breaking point, had found its footing again. Transparent systems replaced assumptions. Oversight replaced blind faith. What had nearly collapsed under secrecy now grew under clarity. Clients returned. Partnerships stabilized. Growth followed, not aggressively, but sustainably. David took pride in that, but not for the reasons he once might have. Success no longer felt like control. It felt like stewardship. Across the table, Margaret caught his eye and smiled. Later, when dishes were cleared and voices softened, she joined him by the window. "We didn't lose each other," she said quietly, "even when it felt like we might." David slipped his arm around her. "We learned how to fight for the right things." They stood together, comfortable in the silence that had once felt so threatening. Emily had stepped fully into her role within the business now, not as a symbol of repair, but as a leader in her own right. She asked hard questions. She set boundaries. She followed through. David watched her operate with a mixture of relief and pride, knowing she wasn't trying to prove herself anymore. She was simply being responsible. Kyle supported her from a different place, now not as a shield, but as a partner. Their marriage carried scars, but it also carried honesty. That mattered more than perfection ever could. As the evening wound down, David looked around the table one last time. This family wasn't untouched by hardship. It was shaped by it, stronger where it had been tested, wiser where it had once been careless. He understood now that legacy wasn't about wealth or reputation alone. It was about what endured when both were threatened. As the family gathered together, united, they moved forward stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever, ready to face whatever the future holds.